He pulled his shirt off on 107th and Grape, yelling for somebody to run a fade. The block was tense while rival faces crowded closer, their colors loud in the daylight. The challenge hung in the air with no punches thrown, only silence stretching before the first gun cracked. That moment left a body on the ground and whispers spreading across Watts. What went down that afternoon wasn't just about one man or one corner. It pulled two hoods into a chain of payback that stretched for years. The story of Varrio, Grape, and Fudge Mafia is still felt today. Watts has always been a small piece of Los Angeles with a heavy weight on its back. The neighborhood sits east of the Harbor Freeway and north of Compton, boxed in by borders people outside barely understand. On the block, these lines mean everything, because every street corner can decide who lives or who gets pressed. Watts is famous for the Watts Towers, but for the people living there, the real landmarks are Jordan Downs, Imperial Courts, and Nickerson Gardens. Those projects shaped generations of families and also shaped the gangs that carried their names. By the mid-70s, Fudgetown Mafia Crips had taken form from a Watts dance crew called For the Money. What started as a little local group shifted into something else once the streets hardened. Their territory sat between Wilmington and Wagon Avenues, stretching from 102nd Street up to 108th. Corners like 105th and 107th became their heart. And their cliques like the T-Funk Riders and the 107th Street Boys gave the crew structure. They carried brown and blue, claiming Crip, but their block name always carried weight. Some old heads say the name Fudge comes from Figueroa and 108th, while police records kept it simple and called them Fudgetown Mafia. North of them, inside Jordan Downs, the Grape Street Watts Crips had already been holding ground since the late 1970s. They wore purple and held a reputation across South Los Angeles as one of the bigger Crip sets. Their name carried weight on the east side, and their alliances spread across other Crip sets, while their rivals included multiple blood cliques. Out of that foundation, another branch grew, the Watts Varrio Grape Street Gang. This crew was made up mostly of Latino members, and while they stayed connected to the bigger Grape Street Crips, they had their own lanes. They claimed purple too, and their ranks mixed with the larger Crip family but also brought their own tensions. The geography made it messy. Fudgetown sat right below Grape Street turf, basically surrounded by the Grapes on almost every side. Officer Cervantes later testified in court that Fudgetown's small section was boxed in by Grape Street and Varrio Grape, making it impossible for them to move without brushing against rivals. On corners like 107th and 108th, the hoods overlapped, and the streets mixed daily. Neighbors saw each other all the time, which made things both easy and dangerous. You could chill with somebody one day, then find yourself tested the next. Watts in the mid-80s had already felt the pressure of gang culture, with murder rates climbing and the crack era pulling in a lot of young lives. By 1989, the murder rate had jumped 50% from the year before, and every block had stories of somebody lost. Growing up there meant learning how to carry yourself. You had to know who to nod at, when to keep your mouth shut, and what colors you could wear. Respect on the block was serious currency, and retaliation was how you kept that respect. That was the politics of the hood. Fudgetown and the Grapes weren't outsiders to each other. They were neighbors who walked the same blocks and sometimes even chilled at the same spots. But proximity breeds friction when the culture is built on reputation. In a place where boundaries overlap, every glance, every tag on a wall, every color flashed on the wrong street could light up a problem. That is what made Watts different from bigger, spread out neighborhoods. The streets were close, the projects crowded, and the lines between sets blurred too easily. Before the body dropped in 2008, Fudgetown Mafia and the Grape sets lived in a strange balance. People from both sides saw each other constantly. Kids grew up attending the same schools, and even family connections ran between crews. For years, the relationship could be described as tense but manageable. Officer Cervantes himself would later say that before 2008, they were basically neighbors for the most part. That line shows how the two sides handled each other. They tolerated each other enough to avoid constant shootouts, but the respect between them was thin. The closeness of turf meant boundaries were tested daily. Fudgetown was surrounded on nearly every side by Grape Street or Varrio Grape presence. Walk too far north and you stepped into Jordan Downs territory. Slide east and you might catch Varrio Grape holding ground. Even south and west, the influence of bigger Crip sets pressed on Fudgetown's smaller circle. That reality created tension, that could never fully disappear. Everyone knew the wrong walk home could lead to a confrontation, and everyone knew one act of disrespect could spark something ugly. Stories from the block mention how both crews sometimes hung out together, whether at parties, local shops, or just posted on the corners. They shared enemies outside Watts, which at times created temporary alliances. But whispers of disrespect built slowly over years. Small fights in backstreets, graffiti tags marked over by rivals, and colors worn in places they weren't supposed to appear kept raising tension. Those little signs don't always make headlines, but in gang culture they matter. A blue hat on the wrong street or a purple shirt outside Jordan Downs could mean more than outsiders would ever think. By the early 2000s, the fragile coexistence was already showing cracks. The younger members on both sides were coming up in an era of higher pressure, with gang politics playing out more aggressively. Social gatherings that once mixed the crews turned colder, and the lines became sharper. Old heads might still talk about times when they were just neighbors, but the younger ones didn't remember that peace. They grew up in an atmosphere where proving yourself was the only way forward. So when 2008 arrived, Watts was sitting on thin ice. The block politics were loaded with history, and the respect between Fudgetown and Varrio Grape was already stretched thin. All it needed was one reckless act on a hot corner to tip everything over the edge. That act came on 107th and Grape, and from there the fragile peace was gone. By the start of 2008, the streets of Watts were loaded with tension that nobody could ignore. On January 17th, a young Fudgetown member named Arty Pull, sometimes called Limp in stories, stepped into the middle of that pressure. Arty was only 21 years old, and like many young dudes from Fudgetown, he was trying to hold his name strong in the neighborhood. That afternoon, Arty was riding with his aunt Luz Gutierrez and his 14-year-old niece Reiko. They even had a baby in the back seat while running around Watts like it was just another day. According to reports, the three of them stopped off at a liquor store, and Arty grabbed himself some beer before asking Luz to swing by the block. The spot he wanted to pull up at was the corner of 107th and Grape Street. That corner was a known meeting place where Fudgetown members often gathered with friends. Luz parked the car near the corner, and Arty got out to talk to one of his boys known as DC, another Fudgetown member who was already outside chilling. Not long after, a teenager named Gilbert Sanchez rolled up on a bicycle. Gilbert was a member of Watts' Varrio Grape, and witnesses later said he tried speaking with Arty. The words between them were not calm, and Arty started pressing Gilbert in an aggressive way that made the situation uncomfortable. Gilbert did not hang around long. He turned his bike around and went to gather reinforcements. Gilbert came back with family and more muscle behind him. He brought along his brother Derek Deadman, his cousin Richard Sanchez, and another Varrio Grape member named Leonard Roachcha. Leonard Roachcha was known on the block for repping the Varrio Grape set hard, wearing purple, throwing up hand signs, and even having tattoos tied to the gang. By the time the group arrived, the tension was heavy. Two sides now stood facing each other at the corner of 107th and Grape. Arty was clearly intoxicated from the drinking he had done earlier with his aunt. Witnesses described him as loud and animated, with his voice carrying down the street as he shouted at the Grape members. Arty then made a move that would seal his fate. He pulled off his shirt right there on the corner, yelling for somebody to fight him. He was waving his arms, pacing, and daring them to step up. Reiko later testified that her uncle did not have a weapon, and he did not throw the first punch. His aunt Luz also confirmed he was unarmed, standing bare-chested and shouting. The Varrio Grape crew saw his actions as complete disrespect. Leonard Roachcha stepped forward with a gun already tucked on him. He pulled it out and fired shots at close range. Arty Pull was struck multiple times, including a fatal bullet to the back of his head. He collapsed instantly on the sidewalk, while his niece and cousin Richard Sanchez both later recalled hearing the shots and watching him fall. Doctors would later confirm Arty had a high blood alcohol level that day, nearly double the legal limit. But the facts were clear in court. He never pulled a weapon, and he never got the chance to throw a punch. The challenge for a fade ended with bullets in his body. The scene turned chaotic immediately after the shots rang out on 107th Street. People scattered in every direction, with the Grape crew running off one way and Fudgetown witnesses trying to get out of the line of fire. Luz Gutierrez grabbed her niece and the baby, terrified for their lives while her nephew lay dying on the sidewalk. At first, nobody wanted to speak with detectives. Luz and Reiko were too scared to cooperate, fearing retaliation from Varrio Grape if they told the truth. Even Richard Sanchez, who was family to Gilbert and Derek, hesitated before eventually confirming details about who was there. That kind of silence is common in Watts, because everybody knows snitching can bring more bullets to your door. Neighbors were shaken by the killing. Seeing another young man stretched out on the pavement had almost become routine, but this case stood out because of how reckless it seemed. A shirtless challenge turned into a killing that the whole block would keep repeating. LAPD officers rolled into the area quickly, marking the scene as another gang shooting in Varrio Grape territory. Detectives made note of the fact that the corner of 107th and Grape was well known as Varrio Grape turf. Officer Cervantes later testified in court that Fudge Town members were essentially intruding on enemy ground when they pulled up there. From the police point of view, Leonard Roachcha opened fire to defend his gang's name and image. Roachcha did not deny who he was when investigators came for him. When arrested, he was wearing a purple Washington Nationals hat, a purple shirt, and purple shoes. He also had tattoos tied directly to his set, including a large W for Watts and another tattoo of a figure wearing a purple bandana. Prosecutors later used those details to paint him as a committed Varrio Grape member who fired to protect his gang's respect. The story of Arty Pull's death spread quickly through Watts. People repeated the same phrase again and again. He took his shirt off, asked for a fade, and caught bullets instead. On the block, that moment became legend, not because of glory, but because of how fast a loud challenge turned into death. It marked the beginning of years of heavy bloodshed between Fudgetown Mafia Crips and Watts Varrio Grape. When the case of Arty Pull's killing finally reached the courtroom, the spotlight fell heavy on Leonard Roachcha. Prosecutors in Los Angeles County filed murder charges and built their case around the testimony of the people who saw everything happen. Two key witnesses were Arty's aunt Luz Gutierrez and her niece Reiko, who were both present when the shots rang out on 107th and Grape. At first, both women were reluctant to testify. Fear of retaliation from Varrio Grape hung over them, and detectives had to ensure their safety before they opened up. Eventually, they spoke, confirming that Arty never had a weapon, never swung first, and only stripped his shirt while yelling. Their testimony lined up with the forensic evidence that showed he was shot from behind, with a fatal bullet striking the back of his head. The prosecution leaned on that detail, stressing that no reasonable claim of self-defense could exist in this situation. They argued that Roachcha had not responded to a threat, but instead chose to enforce gang rules by punishing disrespect. During trial, gang expert officer Salvador Cervantes gave testimony about how Roachcha acted to raise his status inside the Varrio Grape set. He explained that killings like this serve as examples, making rivals fear the group and reinforcing reputation inside the gang. The evidence in court painted a clear picture. Roachcha had been arrested wearing purple gear from his hat to his sneakers. He carried tattoos that showed direct ties to Varrio Grape, including the letter W and a figure with a purple bandana. Prosecutors even presented photos of him throwing up the G hand sign, a known symbol for Grape Street. Roachcha's defense team tried to argue he acted out of fear because Arty was behaving erratically that afternoon. They suggested that Roachcha thought Arty might have a weapon hidden. The court rejected this claim firmly, pointing to the bullet wounds in Arty's back and head. Judges remarked on the irony of calling it self-defense when the victim had only asked for a fistfight. In 2011, Leonard Roachcha was convicted of first-degree murder in the case of Arty Pull. He was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison, where he remains today. The court's decision became another piece of the wider feud because Roachcha's conviction did not calm the streets. Instead, it left Fudgetown and Varrio Grape staring each other down with even more reasons to retaliate. The killing of Arty Pull in January 2008 planted the first seeds of vengeance, but the feud did not explode overnight. The next few years in Watts were filled with small sparks, quiet resentment, and the kind of daily disrespect that always sets gangs on edge. By March 2011, the fragile balance between Fudgetown Mafia and Varrio Grape finally collapsed. On that month, a Fudgetown member known as Stebo was stabbed by someone from the Varrio Grape side. That stabbing turned the simmering resentment into open warfare. Investigators would later testify in court that the event marked the point when things fully shifted into bloodshed. The aftermath was brutal. From early 2011 into the next year, police tracked more than 30 shootings tied directly to the rivalry. At least 7 murders were counted as part of the feud during that span. The blocks around 107th Street became hot zones where drive-by shootings, walk-up shootings, and sudden ambushes were part of everyday life. One of the most vicious killings came on October 11, 2011. That morning, a Varrio Grape member named Oscar Arevalo, also known as Knuckles, was standing on the corner of 106th Street and Wilmington Avenue. Witnesses said 2 men approached him armed with a Beretta and a Glock. They opened fire, hitting him repeatedly before standing over him and firing again. Arevalo was shot 21 times with 15 bullets striking his head and face. Police later arrested 2 Fudge Town members for the murder. Their names were Jamal King, also called Badass, and Melvin Lemon, also known as Baby Nephi. Prosecutors charged both men, and eventually they were convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The motive, according to investigators, was clear retaliation. Fudge Town had lost one of their own earlier that year when Reginald McDaniel, also called Chuck Wayne, was shot near 115th and Grape. That murder was blamed on Varrio Grape, and Fudge Town answered by targeting Arevalo in broad daylight. This cycle of killings became the new normal for Watts during those years. Every shooting demanded an answer, and every answer demanded another strike. Respect on the block was built by keeping your crew's name alive through retaliation, and that code fueled the violence. By the end of 2011, nobody doubted that a full-scale war was active between Fudgetown Mafia and Watts Varrio Grape, a war that showed no signs of slowing down. By summer 2012, the war between Fudgetown and Varrio Grape had already claimed several lives. The violence was no longer just confined to known members and hot corners. It was spilling into family homes, front yards, and ordinary lives. On June 4th, the feud crossed a line that stunned the entire city of Los Angeles. That evening, a 21-year-old immigrant named Mauro Cortez was outside his home on South Hickory Street in Watts. He was holding his 14-month-old son Angel in his arms while talking with friends and relatives. Mauro was not from the gang world and had no real knowledge of the politics that surrounded his neighborhood. He worked, cared for his family, and tried to avoid the kind of conflicts that destroyed so many lives around him. The detail that changed everything that day was a purple shirt. A friend at the gathering had passed around new t-shirts with Honda designs. Mauro drove a Honda and thought nothing of it when he pulled one over his shoulders. The shirt was purple, which on those streets was the known color for Grape Street sets. Mauro did not understand that colors could make him a target on the wrong day. As Mauro stood outside holding Angel, a gunman rode up on a bicycle. Witnesses described the shooter as a young black male wearing a dark-colored hoodie. Without hesitation, the rider pulled out a revolver from his pocket and opened fire into the crowd gathered outside the house. Chaos erupted as shots cracked through the evening air. People scattered in every direction, some diving for cover while others froze in place. Mauro himself was struck in the shoulder, but his focus was entirely on his son. When the gunfire stopped, he looked down and realized Angel had been hit. Neighbors rushed to help as Mauro tried to process what happened. One woman described Angel's eyes wide open, but his tiny body unresponsive. She said she could see into his wounds and his pale face showed how serious it was. Another woman performed CPR desperately, trying to keep the baby alive until paramedics arrived. Emergency crews rushed Angel to the hospital while Mauro rode along in pain from his own injury. Hours later, despite every attempt to save him, Angel Cortez was pronounced dead from 2 gunshot wounds. He was just 14 months old, and his death became a defining tragedy in the long feud. Detectives launched a massive investigation. Witnesses gave statements, though many were vague out of fear. Police recovered a bullet from the scene and identified impact marks on cars and nearby objects. Early descriptions pointed to a young black male on a bike, but that was not enough to close the case. The city quickly offered a $50,000 reward for information, and AEG President Timothy Lewiecki added another $50,000. $100,000 on the table showed how serious officials took the killing of an innocent child. The suspect eventually identified was 15-year-old Donald Ray Dokins, known on the street as Infant Stebo. Detectives from the gang unit had previously encountered him, and took photos that later became part of the case. Dokens was a member of Fudgetown Mafia Crips and connected to the T-Funk Riders clique. Witnesses identified him in photographic lineups, although some hesitated and gave conflicting answers. Investigators also recovered a sweatshirt in a vacant house near the scene, and DNA analysis linked the clothing to Dokens. Social media posts added to the case. Detectives found photos of Dokens wearing a brown hat labeled Riders Only, with letters tying him to the T-Funk Riders clique. His own post placed him among known Fudgetown affiliates, and his reputation as a young shooter carried weight in the neighborhood. Prosecutors argued that the shooting was done to benefit Fudgetown. Gang expert Samuel Omar Marullo testified that Dokens was the youngest known member of the clique and that new members earned status through shootings. He explained that in order to hold a place in T-Funk Riders, you had to prove yourself as a shooter. To the court, that meant Angel's death was the product of gang politics, not random chance. The defense fought back, claiming the identifications were unreliable. They pointed out that the shooter was described as left-handed, while Dokens was right-handed. They argued that nighttime lighting made it difficult to clearly see who fired. They emphasized that the weapon and bicycle were never recovered. Their position was that too many details were unclear to convict. The jury did not agree. Testimony from Mauro, his partner Liliana, and other family members painted a vivid picture of what happened that night. Combined with the sweatshirt DNA and gang evidence, the case convinced the court. Donald Ray Dokens was convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of Angel Cortez, attempted murder for wounding Mauro, and gang enhancements for committing the crime as part of Fudgetown. He was sentenced to 90 years to life in prison. The community was devastated. An innocent baby had been caught in a gang war that he had no part in. The purple shirt that marked him as a target was only a piece of clothing to his father, but on the block, it carried meaning that cost a life. The feud between Fudgetown Mafia and Varrio Grape had already spilled plenty of blood, but this killing left scars that reached far beyond the gang world. Even after the shocking conviction of a 15-year-old shooter, the feud between Fudgetown and Varrio Grape continued to burn. The cycle of retaliation was not stopped by one courtroom decision because respect and revenge still drove the block politics. On October 25, 2018, another killing tied to the rivalry drew attention. A 21-year-old man named Hugo Zuniga was walking in Watts when gunmen pulled up on him. Reports say he was shot 8 times in total, his body left on the pavement in broad daylight. What made this case different was that Zuniga was not a gang member. He was described as someone minding his business when the shooters rolled through. To police, the killing showed how the war had moved beyond direct targets and now threatened anyone standing in the wrong place. Investigators determined that the shooters were connected to Fudgetown Mafia. They had driven into Varrio Grape territory specifically looking for a rival, but instead opened fire on Zuniga. Evidence later revealed the shooters used stolen license plates on their car, a detail that showed planning and an attempt to avoid detection. Convictions followed, with prosecutors presenting the killing as part of the long-standing cycle of retaliation. The death of Zuniga underlined how much the feud continued to spill into the lives of bystanders, years after the first shots on 107th and Grape. The record of this feud is split between official court documents and the stories told on the streets. Court records give clear details like Arty Pull being unarmed, shot in the back of the head, and Leonard Roachcha receiving 50 years to life. On the streets, people tell the story differently. Some say Arty had gone onto enemy turf seeking revenge for something earlier. Others suggest he owed money or carried hidden motives that never came out in court. None of those stories were confirmed by official investigations, but they circulate because that is how hood lore works. Other rumors focus on strange details. One story mentions a 6-pack of purple drink cans left at a scene as a disrespect sign, though no police report confirms it. Local blogs and YouTube storytellers keep those tales alive, mixing fact with imagination. What remains consistent in every version is the key moment: a shirtless challenge on 107th and Grape, a pistol pulled, and a body dropped. From that moment, the feud intensified and created years of violence. Graffiti wars, disrespectful tags, and small fights often reignited sparks in the years that followed. Even when one case seemed closed in court, the street would quickly write the next chapter. Respect was always on the line, and that code made sure the cycle kept spinning. Today, The corner of 107th and Grape still carries the memory of what happened. Locals remember a young man pulling off his shirt for a fight and ending up shot on the ground. That single act of bravado became the starting point of one of Watts' bloodiest gang feuds. Court records have closed the cases. Roachcha was sentenced, Dokins was sentenced, and other shooters along the way were locked down. But convictions never ended the scars left on families and neighborhoods. People still talk about the night the baby died, the morning Knuckles was shot 21 times, and the day Arty challenged Varrio Grape with no weapon. For the residents of Watts, those stories are not distant history. They are part of everyday memory, reminders of how one reckless move can echo for years. Kids grow up hearing the names, seeing the graffiti, and walking the same streets. The war might not be as loud as before, but the pain remains heavy. In this story, fists were never really thrown. The challenge for a fade turned into bullets, and the hood paid the price. The corner of 107th and Grape became more than an address. It became a symbol of how fast respect can turn into tragedy in Watts.